The emergency dispatcher's voice crackled through the phone lines at exactly 3:47 in the afternoon, her trained calm barely masking the urgency that would soon tear through Sunshine Manor Senior Center like a hurricane. 911. "What's your emergency?" she asked, fingers already poised over her keyboard, ready to deploy the full force of emergency response based on the breathless voice that screamed back at her. "There's a bomb. Oh my God. There's a bomb at the senior center on Maple Street. An old man. He's got explosives. He's going to kill everyone. Please hurry. Please. People are going to die." The voice belonged to Karen Whitfield, 53 years old, resident of the upscale Willowbrook neighborhood, and the most persistent thorn in the side of anyone who had ever tried to live peacefully within a 5-mile radius of her perfectly manicured lawn. Inside Sunshine Manor, Harold Goldstein sat in his favorite armchair by the large windows that overlooked the community garden, completely unaware that his life was about to change forever. The 82-year-old retired electrician was absorbed in the crossword puzzle from the morning paper, occasionally glancing up to watch the hummingbirds that visited the feeders he had installed just outside the window. His weathered hands, still steady despite his age, gripped a mechanical pencil as he filled in another answer. The afternoon sun streamed through the glass, warming his face and making him feel drowsy in the most pleasant way possible. The senior center buzzed with its usual afternoon activities. In the main recreation room, Dolores Martinez led her weekly bridge club, her animated gestures punctuating every hand she played. "Harold, you should join us next week," she had called out earlier. "We need someone who can actually count cards without falling asleep." The comment had drawn chuckles from the other residents, but Harold had simply smiled and waved them off, preferring the solitude of his crossword puzzles and the gentle companionship of the birds outside. Margaret Chen, the center's activities director, moved through the space with practiced efficiency, checking on residents and making sure everyone was comfortable. She had worked at Sunshine Manor for 12 years, and in all that time, she had never encountered a more peaceful, loving community. The residents looked out for each other, shared stories, celebrated birthdays, and mourned losses together. It was exactly the kind of place she had envisioned when she first decided to work with seniors. But Karen Whitfield saw something entirely different when she looked at Sunshine Manor. To her, the cheerful yellow building with its well-maintained gardens and happy residents represented everything wrong with the neighborhood. The increased foot traffic from visitors bothered her. The occasional sound of laughter from outdoor activities disrupted her afternoon quiet time. Most importantly, the presence of the center had prevented her from purchasing the adjacent lot, where she had planned to build a second garage for her collection of vintage cars. The conflict had begun 3 months earlier during a heated neighborhood association meeting. Karen had presented a detailed PowerPoint presentation outlining her concerns about the senior center, complete with traffic flow charts and property value analyses. "This facility is bringing down our entire neighborhood," she had declared, pointing at her slides with a laser pointer. "The constant stream of visitors, the noise levels, the parking issues. It's simply unacceptable for a residential area." Harold had attended that meeting, one of the few residents who still drove and felt comfortable speaking in public forums. He had listened patiently to Karen's presentation before standing to respond. "Ma'am, with all due respect, we're not causing any real problems. We're just trying to live our lives with dignity and community. Most of us have lived in this neighborhood longer than you have." His voice had been gentle but firm, and several neighbors had nodded in agreement. That response had ignited something dark in Karen's personality. She had spent the following weeks documenting every perceived infraction, taking photographs of visitors' cars, measuring noise levels with a decibel meter she had purchased online, and filing complaint after complaint with the city council. When those efforts failed to produce the results she wanted, she had escalated to calling code enforcement, the health department, and even the fire marshal, claiming various safety violations that subsequent inspections proved to be completely unfounded. The breaking point had come just 1 week before the emergency call. Harold had been working in the community garden, installing a new trellis for the climbing roses that the residents had voted to plant along the garden's eastern border. The project was completely within the property boundaries and had been approved by the center's board of directors. But Karen had marched out of her house and confronted him directly. "You can't just build whatever you want, wherever you want," she had snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "This is a residential neighborhood, not some kind of commune where you people can do whatever strikes your fancy." Harold had looked up from his work, dirt on his hands, and genuine confusion in his eyes. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but this is our property. We're just trying to make it beautiful for everyone to enjoy." "Your property? This whole place is a blight on the neighborhood. You old people need to accept that you don't belong here anymore. There are facilities for people like you, places where you can be properly supervised and not bother decent homeowners." The cruelty in her words had stung Harold more than he cared to admit. He had served in the Navy for 6 years, worked as an electrician for 43 years, raised 3 children, and paid taxes in this very neighborhood for over 3 decades. To be dismissed as some kind of unwanted burden felt like a physical blow. But Harold had simply nodded, gathered his tools, and walked back inside without another word. That evening, Margaret had found Harold sitting alone in the common area, staring out at the garden he had been working on. "You okay? Harold, Rosa mentioned you seemed upset earlier." "Just dealing with that neighbor lady again. She's got a real problem with us being here." Harold had sighed deeply. "I don't understand why some people can't just let others live in peace." Margaret had sat down beside him, following his gaze out to the garden. "Some people carry so much anger inside them that they have to pour it out somewhere. Unfortunately, they usually pick targets who can't fight back effectively." Now, as the wail of sirens grew louder in the distance, Harold remained blissfully unaware that Karen's anger had found its most destructive outlet yet. The emergency dispatcher had immediately alerted the bomb squad, the SWAT team, and every available patrol unit in the county. Protocol demanded a full-scale response to any bomb threat, especially one involving a facility housing vulnerable elderly residents. The first police car screamed into the parking lot at 3:51, followed immediately by 3 more patrol vehicles. Officers emerged with weapons drawn, their faces grim with the knowledge that they were potentially walking into a disaster zone. Lieutenant Sarah Rodriguez, a 15-year veteran of the force, took charge of the scene, establishing a perimeter and beginning the process of evacuation. "This is the police. Everyone needs to exit the building immediately. This is not a drill." The amplified voice boomed through the center's hallways, causing immediate confusion and panic among the residents. Many of the elderly occupants moved slowly, some requiring assistance with walkers or wheelchairs, and the sudden urgency sent several into states of distress that their aging hearts could barely handle. Margaret rushed to help coordinate the evacuation, her mind racing to account for every resident while trying to understand what could possibly be happening. "Officers, what's going on? What kind of emergency are we dealing with?" "Ma'am, we received a report of explosives on the premises. We need everyone out of the building now. Do you have a complete resident list?" Lieutenant Rodriguez's voice was professional, but urgent. The word explosives sent a chill through Margaret's spine. She quickly grabbed the emergency contact list from her office, while helping guide confused residents toward the exits. Dolores Martinez clutched her chest, her face pale with shock. "Explosives. Here, that's impossible. We're just playing bridge." Harold heard the commotion from his spot by the window and slowly rose from his chair, his joints protesting the sudden movement. The crossword puzzle fell from his lap as he tried to understand what was happening. Through the window, he could see police cars filling the parking lot, their red and blue lights flashing in a dizzying display that made his eyes water. "Sir, you need to evacuate immediately." A young officer appeared at Harold's side, his hand hovering near his weapon. "Are you Harold Goldstein?" The question sent a jolt of confusion through Harold's mind. "Yes, that's me. But I don't understand what's happening. Why are you asking for me specifically?" Instead of answering, the officer spoke into his radio. "I've located the subject. He's in the main common area by the windows." The response crackled back immediately. "Detain and search. Consider him extremely dangerous." The words "extremely dangerous" seemed to hang in the air like a toxic cloud. Harold's confusion deepened into genuine fear as he realized that somehow, impossibly, he had become the focus of this emergency response. "Officer, I think there's been some kind of mistake. I was just doing my crossword puzzle. I haven't done anything wrong." But the officer was already calling for backup, and within seconds, Harold found himself surrounded by 3 armed policemen, their weapons trained on him with deadly precision. The elderly man's hands began to shake, not from fear of the weapons pointed at him, but from the dawning realization that his peaceful afternoon had somehow transformed into a nightmare beyond his comprehension. "Put your hands where we can see them. Do not make any sudden movements." The commands came from multiple directions, creating a cacophony of authority that made Harold's head spin. He raised his trembling hands, the mechanical pencil still clutched in his right fist. "Drop the device. Drop it now," one of the officers shouted, apparently interpreting the pencil as some kind of detonator. The absurdity of the situation might have been comical under different circumstances, but Harold could see the genuine fear and tension in the officers' faces, and he understood that his life was in serious danger. He dropped the pencil, watching it clatter harmlessly to the floor beside his chair. "Please, officers, there's been some kind of terrible mistake. I'm just an old man doing puzzles. I don't have any explosives. I wouldn't even know how to make a bomb if I wanted to." Outside in the parking lot, the evacuation continued in chaotic fashion. Elderly residents sat in wheelchairs and on portable chairs that the staff had quickly arranged, many of them wrapped in blankets despite the warm afternoon temperature. The shock of the sudden evacuation had left most of them in various states of distress, and several required immediate medical attention from the paramedics who had arrived as part of the emergency response. Margaret stood with Lieutenant Rodriguez, her face a mask of worry and confusion. "I still don't understand what this is about. Harold Goldstein is one of our gentlest residents. He spends his days doing crosswords and watching birds. The idea that he would have explosives is absolutely ridiculous." "Ma'am, we have to take every threat seriously." The caller was very specific about Mr. Goldstein and claimed to have witnessed him placing explosive devices in the building. "We can't take any chances with the safety of your residents." The word caller caught Margaret's attention. "Who called this in? Did they identify themselves?" Lieutenant Rodriguez checked her notes. "A Karen Whitfield. She lives in the neighborhood and claimed to have seen suspicious activity." The name hit Margaret like a physical blow. She had dealt with Karen's complaints and harassment for months, but this level of malicious fabrication was beyond anything she had imagined possible. "Officer, that woman has been trying to get our center shut down for months. She's filed dozens of false complaints against us. This has to be another one of her lies." But even as Margaret spoke, she could hear raised voices from inside the building, and her heart sank with the realization that the situation was escalating beyond anyone's control. Harold's gentle voice carried through the open windows, pleading with the officers to understand that there had been a mistake, while the sharp commands of law enforcement grew more aggressive by the moment. Inside the building, Harold found himself forced to his knees, his hands zip-tied behind his back, while officers conducted a thorough search of his person and the immediate area around his chair. Every pocket was emptied, every belonging examined with intense scrutiny. The crossword puzzle book, his reading glasses, a small packet of tissues, and a few pieces of hard candy were laid out on a nearby table, like evidence in a criminal trial. "Where are the explosives? Harold, we know you have them somewhere. Make this easy on yourself and tell us where they are." The interrogation began immediately, with officers alternating between good cop and bad cop approaches that seemed lifted directly from a television drama. "I keep telling you, there are no explosives. I don't know anything about bombs. I was just sitting here doing my puzzle." Harold's voice was growing weaker, the stress of the situation beginning to take a toll on his aging cardiovascular system. The search expanded throughout the building, with officers examining every room, every closet, every possible hiding place where explosive devices might be concealed. The bomb squad arrived with their specialized equipment, their bulky protective suits adding an even more ominous atmosphere to the already tense situation. Dogs were brought in to sniff for explosive materials, their handlers guiding them through every inch of the facility. As the search continued without finding any evidence of explosives, some of the officers began to express doubts about the validity of the threat. But the pressure to maintain the investigation remained intense, partly because nobody wanted to be responsible for calling off a bomb threat that turned out to be real, and partly because the initial caller had been so convincing in her panic and specificity. Karen Whitfield watched the unfolding drama from her living room window, a cup of tea growing cold in her hands as she observed the chaos she had created. Part of her felt a surge of satisfaction at seeing the senior center finally facing serious consequences. But another part of her was beginning to understand that the situation had grown far beyond what she had originally intended. She had expected the police to investigate, perhaps question Harold and search the building, then leave when they found nothing. The idea that her false report would result in a full-scale military-style response with SWAT teams and bomb squads had not occurred to her. But now that she had set events in motion, she found herself trapped by her own lies, unable to admit the truth without facing serious criminal charges herself. Back at the senior center, Harold's condition was deteriorating rapidly. The stress of being treated as a terrorist suspect, combined with the physical strain of being forced to kneel with his hands bound behind his back, had triggered a series of chest pains that he tried desperately to hide from his captors. At his age, any sudden shock to his system could prove fatal, and the current situation was about as shocking as anything he had ever experienced. "Please, I need to sit down. My heart. I have a condition." His request was met with suspicion rather than compassion. "Nice try, old man. We're not falling for any tricks. Where did you hide the bombs?" The officer's response revealed a level of callousness that would later become a central issue in the investigation of the incident. Margaret fought to get closer to the building, desperate to check on Harold and the other residents who might still be inside. But the police perimeter kept her at a distance that made her feel helpless and frustrated. "That man has a heart condition. He takes medication. You can't treat him like this." Her protests fell on deaf ears as the search intensified. More equipment arrived, including a mobile command center and additional personnel from surrounding jurisdictions. What had started as a routine response to a bomb threat was quickly becoming the largest emergency operation the county had seen in years. The media arrived next, drawn by the scanner traffic and the obvious scale of the response. News vans lined the street, reporters setting up their cameras and preparing to broadcast live coverage of what they assumed was a genuine terrorist incident at a senior care facility. The story had all the elements that television news thrived on: elderly victims, potential explosives, and a dramatic police response. As the afternoon wore on and no explosives were found, the officers inside the building grew increasingly frustrated with Harold's continued denials. The pressure to produce results, combined with the knowledge that their every move was being scrutinized by supervisors and media, created an atmosphere of tension that would soon explode into tragedy. "We know you're lying. Harold, we have a witness who saw you planting the devices. Stop wasting everyone's time and tell us where they are." The interrogation had become more aggressive, with officers taking turns pressuring the elderly man for information he didn't possess. Harold's breathing had become labored, his face pale and drawn with exhaustion and stress. "I don't know what witness you're talking about. I haven't planted anything anywhere. I just want to go home and forget this ever happened." The mention of wanting to go home seemed to trigger something in one of the younger officers, who interpreted it as a potential confession or threat. "Home. You're not going anywhere until we find those bombs. And if people get hurt because you won't cooperate, their blood is on your hands." The accusation was like a dagger to Harold's heart. The idea that he could be responsible for hurting innocent people, especially his friends and neighbors at the senior center, was more than his conscience could bear. "Please, you have to believe me. I would never hurt anyone. These people are my family. This place is my home." But his emotional plea only seemed to further convince the officers that he was hiding something. The logic of their position was circular and inescapable if he was innocent. Why was he so upset if he had nothing to hide? Why was he being so emotional? The more desperately Harold protested his innocence, the more guilty he appeared to investigators who had already decided on his culpability. Outside, Margaret had managed to contact the center's lawyer and several board members, all of whom were racing to the scene to try to intervene on Harold's behalf. But the police had established such tight security around the building that even legal representatives were having difficulty gaining access to their client. The breakthrough in the case came from an unexpected source: Thomas Chen, Margaret's teenage nephew who had been visiting the center to help with computer maintenance, had been in the building's security office when the evacuation began. In the chaos, everyone had forgotten about the young man, who had remained hidden in the small office, too frightened to reveal himself to the armed officers searching the building. But Thomas had access to something that would change everything: the security camera system that recorded all activity in and around the senior center. As he watched the drama unfold on the monitors, he began reviewing the footage from earlier in the day, looking for any sign of the suspicious activity that had supposedly triggered the emergency response. What he discovered would expose Karen Whitfield's lies and reveal the true nature of the day's events. The cameras clearly showed Harold's entire afternoon, from his arrival at the center through his peaceful crossword session by the window. At no point did he handle any suspicious packages, meet with any unknown individuals, or engage in any activity that could remotely be construed as bomb-making or placement. More importantly, the external cameras captured Karen Whitfield's activities throughout the day. The footage showed her repeatedly approaching the property line, taking photographs, and making phone calls while watching the center's activities. The timestamp on her final phone call matched exactly with the time of the emergency call to 911. Thomas knew he had to get this information to the authorities, but he was terrified of revealing himself to the armed officers who were still searching the building. Instead, he used the center's computer system to email the video files directly to Margaret's phone, along with a message explaining what he had discovered. Margaret received the email just as Harold's situation inside the building was reaching a critical point. The elderly man had collapsed during the interrogation, his heart finally succumbing to the stress of the ordeal. Paramedics were called in, but they had to work under the assumption that their patient was a dangerous terrorist, which limited their ability to provide optimal care. As Harold was loaded onto a stretcher, still restrained and under guard, Margaret approached Lieutenant Rodriguez with her phone in hand. "You need to see this right now. We have video evidence that proves Harold is innocent and that Karen Whitfield made a false report." The lieutenant initially dismissed Margaret's claims, but as she watched the security footage, her expression changed from skepticism to shock to anger. The video evidence was indisputable. Harold Goldstein had done nothing wrong, and Karen Whitfield had deliberately made a false emergency report that had resulted in a massive waste of resources and nearly cost an innocent man his life. "Stop the transport, release those restraints immediately." Lieutenant Rodriguez's commands rang out across the parking lot, but the damage had already been done. Harold was unconscious, his vital signs unstable, and his prognosis uncertain. The ambulance rushed Harold to the county hospital, where he was admitted to the cardiac intensive care unit. The stress-induced heart attack he had suffered was severe, and doctors weren't sure if his 82-year-old body would be able to recover from the trauma of the day's events. Meanwhile, police units were dispatched to Karen Whitfield's residence to place her under arrest for filing a false police report, a felony that carried serious prison time and substantial fines. When officers knocked on her door, they found a woman who was already packed and ready to leave town, her car loaded with suitcases and personal belongings. "Karen Whitfield, you're under arrest for filing a false police report and reckless endangerment. You have the right to remain silent." The Miranda rights that Karen heard seemed surreal, as if she was watching someone else's life fall apart, rather than experiencing the collapse of her own carefully constructed world. The arrest made the evening news, along with footage of the massive emergency response that had been triggered by Karen's lies. The story quickly went viral on social media, with thousands of people expressing outrage at the woman who had nearly killed an innocent elderly man with her malicious false report. At the hospital, Margaret and several other residents from the senior center maintained a vigil in the waiting room, praying for Harold's recovery and trying to process the events of the day. The man who had quietly worked on crossword puzzles and tended to hummingbird feeders had become the center of a media storm that none of them could have imagined. Harold remained unconscious for 3 days, his body fighting to recover from the cardiac episode that had nearly ended his life. When he finally opened his eyes, he found Margaret sitting beside his bed, her face etched with worry and relief. "How are you feeling, Harold?" she asked gently, taking his hand in hers. "Like I've been hit by a truck," he replied weakly, attempting a smile. "What happened to me? The last thing I remember was all those police officers." Margaret explained everything: Karen's false report, the massive police response, the discovery of the security footage, and Karen's subsequent arrest. Harold listened in stunned silence, struggling to comprehend how his quiet afternoon had transformed into such a nightmare. "She really said I had bombs?" he asked, his voice filled with disbelief. "She did, and because of her lies, you nearly died. But Harold, there's something else you should know. The whole community has rallied around you. People from all over the county have been sending cards and flowers. The story has touched a lot of hearts." Indeed, the public response to Harold's ordeal had been overwhelming. The image of an elderly man being treated as a terrorist while doing crossword puzzles had struck a nerve with people across the country. Donations poured in to cover his medical expenses, and hundreds of visitors came to Sunshine Manor to show their support for the residents and staff. The legal consequences for Karen Whitfield were swift and severe. She was charged with filing a false police report, reckless endangerment, and criminal mischief. The prosecutor's office decided to pursue the maximum penalties allowed under law, citing the massive waste of public resources and the serious harm caused to an innocent person. During her sentencing hearing, Karen attempted to justify her actions by claiming she genuinely believed Harold posed a threat to the community. But the security footage contradicted every aspect of her testimony, and the judge was unimpressed by her excuses. "Mrs. Whitfield, your actions represent a calculated attempt to weaponize law enforcement against an innocent person. You wasted hundreds of thousands of dollars in emergency resources, traumatized an entire community of elderly residents, and nearly caused the death of a man whose only crime was existing in a place where you didn't want him to be." The judge sentenced Karen to 3 years in prison, ordered her to pay full restitution for the emergency response costs, and banned her permanently from coming within 500 feet of any senior care facility in the state. Additionally, she was required to forfeit her house to help pay for Harold's medical expenses and emotional damages. The community response to the incident led to significant changes in how emergency calls were handled and investigated. New protocols were established requiring additional verification for bomb threats, especially those targeting vulnerable populations. Training programs were implemented to help officers recognize and respond appropriately to situations involving elderly or disabled individuals. Harold's recovery was slow but steady. The physical damage from his heart attack was manageable with medication and lifestyle changes, but the emotional trauma of being treated as a terrorist took longer to heal. He struggled with anxiety and depression for months, often afraid to leave his room or participate in the activities he had once enjoyed. But the outpouring of support from the community helped him gradually regain his confidence. Letters arrived daily from strangers expressing their sympathy and admiration for his resilience. School children sent handmade cards, and local organizations invited him to speak about his experience. Margaret worked tirelessly to help Harold and the other residents process the trauma of that day. She arranged for counseling services, organized support groups, and made sure that every resident felt safe and valued in their home. 6 months after the incident, Sunshine Manor held a Community Appreciation Day to thank everyone who had supported them during the crisis. Harold, now fully recovered and back to his crossword puzzles, was asked to speak at the event. "I never imagined that doing a crossword puzzle could be so dangerous," he began, drawing gentle laughter from the crowd. "But I also never imagined how much kindness and support could come from such a terrible situation. This community showed me that there are far more good people in the world than bad ones, and that gives me hope for the future." The event raised additional funds for the senior center and helped strengthen the bonds between the facility and the surrounding neighborhood. New volunteers signed up to help with activities and maintenance, and several local businesses pledged ongoing support for the center's programs. Harold returned to his daily routine of crossword puzzles and birdwatching, but with a new appreciation for the simple pleasures of life and the importance of community. The hummingbirds still visited his feeders every day, seemingly unaware of the drama that had unfolded in their quiet corner of the world. The garden trellis that Harold had been installing on the day of the incident was completed by a team of volunteers, and it soon became covered with beautiful climbing roses that bloomed throughout the summer. A small plaque was placed nearby, reading "Harold's Garden, a place of peace and resilience." As autumn arrived and the leaves began to change colors, Harold reflected on the strange journey that had brought him from terror to healing. He had learned that evil existed in the world, sometimes in the most unexpected places. But he had also learned that good people would always outnumber the bad ones, and that communities could overcome even the most devastating attacks on their peace and security. The crossword puzzle that had fallen from his lap on that terrible afternoon was framed and hung on the wall of the recreation room, a reminder of how quickly life could change and how important it was to cherish every ordinary moment. Harold never finished that particular puzzle, but in many ways, his life had become a different kind of puzzle, one where all the pieces eventually fit together to create a picture of hope, resilience, and the enduring power of human kindness. Karen Whitfield served her full sentence in state prison, where she was required to participate in anger management and community service programs. Upon her release, she moved to another state, her reputation permanently tarnished by her actions. The house she had lost to pay for Harold's damages was purchased by a young family who transformed it into a welcoming home, where neighborhood children felt free to play and laugh in the yard. The senior center thrived in the years following the incident, becoming a model for how communities could support and protect their most vulnerable members. Harold lived there happily for many more years, surrounded by friends who had become family, and sustained by the knowledge that he had survived not just a heart attack, but an attack on everything he held dear. And every afternoon, as he sat by his window, working on crossword puzzles, the hummingbirds continued to visit, their presence a daily reminder that beauty and peace could flourish even in a world that sometimes seemed determined to destroy both.